So welcome to our segment on literature and pandemics. We have with us today Christopher Bram and Philip Clark. I know both of them through William and Mary, ironically. And gosh, how long ago was that now? 15?
1999.
That's a long time. Oh my God, I can't believe it.
Century.
Oh my God, I can't believe it's been that long. So 20 years. And I know Chris because he was a visiting writer in residence at William and Mary in the Department of English where I was teaching at the time, and somehow kindly agreed to read some fiction I had written, and we developed a friendship after that. And Philip was a student of mine, although I really feel uncomfortable calling Philip a former student because he knew more than I did, and he still knows more than I do. And
not true, Richard, not true.
But I feel it's more of a we learn from each other relationship. And
it's collegial.
It's collegial. And I feel very privileged to call them friends still 20 some years later. So that's how I know them. And also Philip has the honor of being one of, I think, my second guest in our speakers series at Canisius College that was started 10 years ago now. And so I'm very glad that they both decided to join us in this conversation about literature and meaning and pandemics. So with that, Chris and Philip, if you'd like to do a brief intro, and then we can start our conversation.
Okay, my name's Chris Bram. I'm primarily a novelist who recently has become more interested in writing fiction and history. Did the novel that became the movie Gods and Monsters. That's my big claim to fame. Also did narrative literary history, Eminent Outlaws, the Gay Writers Who Changed America. And I live in New York City, and I now am a teacher at the Gallatin School of New York University.
Philip?
I'm Philip Clark. I live in Falls Church, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. My day job, I'm a high school librarian, but I am also a gay cultural historian, as what I guess I call myself. I'm the co-editor of the anthology Persistent Voices, Poetry by Writers Lost to AIDS, which I have right here. And I am also the co-editor of the collection In the Empire of the Air, the poems of Donald Britt.
Well, thank you both. And those biographical and bibliographical references will also be in the module for people to look at to continue their reading and edification. So, Chris, I think we were going to start with you and some observations about literature and the response to the 1918 flu pandemic.
Yeah, can I just jump right in and talk a little bit about, okay, there have been other pandemics, of course. It's, going back to the Black Death of the 14th century, followed by further outbreaks to the bubonic plague in later centuries. In the 19th century, we had kind of these eruptions of cholera and yellow fever. Cholera had its own political and moral overtones. It's kind of at the center of Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, where it becomes this symbol for the sinister threat of the East. But the great global pandemic of modern times is the influenza epidemic of 1918. Okay, it was known as the Spanish flu, even though we now believe it originated in Kansas, then went overseas to Europe and was distributed throughout the world. It lasted 15 months, from spring 1918 to the summer of 1919. The second wave in the fall of 1918 was the most devastating. The timing was particularly cruel, taking place at the end of the First World War. So soldiers were traveling between home and the front and back again, carrying the disease with them. It affected primarily the young, both children and people in their 20s. And the death toll was horrendous. It was, in the United States alone, it was 675,000 deaths, just a little less than the number of people who died in the Civil War. The Civil War lasted over 4 years. This took place in like a year and 3 months. Worldwide, there were, they're not entirely sure, maybe 50 million deaths, which puts it on a par with the number of people who were actually killed during the Second World War. In 1919, it ends as mysteriously as it begins, without a vaccine. It just kind of, it burned itself out. Historical references, there's a really terrific PBS documentary from 1995, which I think we're posting online that you can watch, called Influenza 1918. Very simple and direct and effective, and it really tells the story very well. There's also an excellent popular history, The Great Influenza by John Barry, which came out, I think, like 2004. So we're talking about kind of the literary responses to epidemics. How do we remember them? How do we write about them? And the flu epidemic of 1918 was so quick and brutal and concentrated, nobody had time to write about it. There was news coverage. That was about it. There was very little, I don't think any nonfiction books were written about it at the time. Everybody was experiencing in a way maybe they felt they didn't need to write about it. However, then the fiction starts appearing about 10 years later. In Thomas Wolfe's novel, Look Homeward, Angel, the brother of the protagonist, Ben Gant, dies of the flu. Then that's the earliest account I know. And I say that was 1929. John O'Hara did a really remarkable short story, The Doctor's Son. That was 1933. Then the great Catherine Ann Porter short novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, in 1936. William Maxwell did a terrific novel, They Came Like Swallows, 1937. All of these stories are very personal. They're autobiographical. They're so personal, in fact, I think many readers don't think of them as being about a historical event. It's about something that happened to this individual. In the Thomas Wolfe novel, I don't think he even acknowledges anyone is sick except his brother. Wanted to look that up to double check. But I remember it's specifically about his brother becoming ill and dying. Wolfe wrote about the death of his brother. William Maxwell about the death of his mother. Catherine Ann Porter about her own illness. John O'Hara wrote about helping his doctor father in their small town in Pennsylvania. So these are all kind of based in autobiography, all based on firsthand experience. And maybe a good way to kind of take a closer look at how it was written about is to just look at one story, and it's, I've chosen Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which is a short novel. Okay, Catherine Ann Porter is one of the great American writers of the 20th century. She didn't write much, but what she wrote was first rate, primarily short stories. She's most famous for her novel Ship of Fools, but her short stories are better. So her short stories are quite amazing. Her account is both personal and social. She gives a wider perspective than the other writers. Yet we still know the story as a piece of autobiography rather than a piece of history. The protagonist, Miranda, is 24, a young woman working for a newspaper in Seattle. And she's just met an Army lieutenant, Adam, who's also 24. And the epidemic has already begun. They see funerals in the street every day. But they think they're safe. Then one day Miranda comes home, falls asleep, and she wakes up feeling very weak, very sick, half dead. Her landlady wants to throw her out, and Adam protects her. He also brings her medicine and news. Here's just a short passage from the piece. It's as bad as anything can be, said Adam. All the theaters and nearly all the shops and restaurants are closed. And the streets have been full of funerals all day and ambulances all night. Miranda and Adam barely know each other. Only now, in fact, when she is sick, do they even learn what their religions are, which is, I think, is a really amazing detail. She goes to the hospital where Adam cannot visit her. The war ends while she's in the hospital. And then she receives a letter from a stranger telling her that Adam died in a camp hospital. The novel ends just as she's about to leave the hospital herself. I'm just going to read, this is the last, from the last page of the novel, this is the close of the novel. Adam, she said, now you need not die again, but still I wish you were here. I wish you had come back. At once he was there beside her, invisible but urgently present, a ghost, but more alive than she was, the last intolerable cheat of her heart. For knowing it was false, she still clung to the lie, the unpardonable lie of her bitter desire. She said, I love you, and stood up trembling, trying by the mere act of her will to bring him to sight before her. If I could call you up from the grave, I would, she said. The room was silent, empty. The ghost was gone from it. Struck away by the sudden violence of her rising and speaking aloud. She came to herself as if out of sleep. Oh no, that was not the way. I must never do that, she warned herself. Miss Tanner, who's the nurse, said, your taxi cab is waiting, my dear. And there was her friend Mary, ready to go. No more war, no more plague, only the day's silence that follows the ceasing of heavy guns, noiseless houses with shades drawn, empty streets, the cold dead light of tomorrow. Now there would be time for everything. Can I turn off the clock? Radio is going off in the next room, right back. It's the close of the short novel. And I love that kind of no more war, no more plague, only the day's silence that follows the ceasing of heavy guns. Noiseless houses with shades drawn, empty streets, the cold dead light of tomorrow. Now there would be time for everything. And it's kind of very, very quietly powerful. And I mean, we have these two world historical events at the end of 1918, the end of the war and the end of the epidemic. And Porter includes both of them. She includes both. But interestingly, only the war has become part of our cultural furniture. We don't remember the 1918 epidemic. That's been kind of wiped out. But the war is remembered first in Armistice Day, which is still a holiday now, but barely noticed. But it was seriously celebrated until World War II. And it was remembered in both novels and Hollywood movies. I can't think of the 1918 epidemic ever appearing in a Hollywood movie. I've been thinking about that. I mean, this kind of forgetting. Something similar happened with AIDS, which Philip will discuss in his look at that pandemic. But it's what different as these two experiences are, that one has, that's something the two of them share. That's something they have in common.
Always good to promote.
Always good to promote, yes. So,
maybe we can have a couple of comments here and then segue into Philip's thing. Or were you done, Chris? With
I'm done. Yeah, that's what I kind of wanted to kind of just the concentrated, put everybody on the same page with the 1918 epidemic.
So I want to go back to something you said in your introduction, and then I have just sort of a comment, and then Philip, if you'd like to chime in as well. Just so that our viewers know, we're going to have, or there is a module on art in response to the 1918 flu pandemic.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And there's going to be an module on plagues in the ancient world, the Justinian plague and the Antonine plague, as well as probably references to like Manzoni, who, an Italian writer who wrote sort of obliquely also about the plague. There's a unit up right now on cholera. It's in Spanish, but it's about cholera and its moral and racial implications in Puerto Rico. And so yeah, so there will be, so part of your introduction will also sort of explore these in other modules. What I found interesting about the section you read was the adjectives describing tomorrow. It was cold and what were those words again about?
The cold, dead light of tomorrow. And that's surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, cold, dead, light. I mean, I guess light is perhaps positive, but cold and dead are really very strongly negative adjectives to describe tomorrow. And I find that very curious. It's not entirely hopeful.
No, I think she's acknowledging life was never the same for me again, or never the same for Miranda, and she is Miranda. I mean, it's, it's third person. I think that life will never be the same for her again.
Very, very, very interesting. I also found it eerie. I'm sorry?
One thing I'll mention too in the context of AIDS is this idea of survivor's guilt. Even if you make it through this traumatic event, you still may be feeling a wellspring of negative emotions from the experience.
Yeah, she has an amazing throwaway line about the ghost being more alive than she is. And it is kind of almost an expression of survivor's guilt in that, yeah.
I also found it really eerie, your introduction where you read a brief quote from the beginning about everything being closed, ambulances constantly, and the sirens. I mean, that also has an uncanny, eerie echo to the early days of the quarantine experience with COVID.
Yeah.
So it's just, and COVID also, something very rapid, very brutal, at least to certain populations. It'll be curious to see how we as a society remember it, deal with it, process it. I mean, I think there are certain sectors of the population that have been affected more, and also it's curious because it's both been a population that is marginal, often the elderly or Black and brown populations for a variety of reasons, but also populations of privilege have been affected in their inconvenience. And I think in terms of universities being shut down. And so it has had other impacts that are just curious. And it'll be interesting to observe how society responds to these various impacts of the disease. And to your main point about, one of your main points about remembering and forgetting, which I think is fascinating, particularly given the numbers, right? And yet still sort of forgetting that. But anyway, those were some of my thoughts. Philip, that's maybe not a good segue to toss the ball over to you, but I'm tossing it to you.
Well, I think I wanted to give a bit of context for AIDS as a disease in order to talk about the literary response. This is a disease that's first reported on in the summer of 1981 in reports from the Centers for Disease Control. And the latter report received coverage in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, but particularly in the gay community, since that was the first community hardest hit, Dr. Lawrence Mass's initial writing in the New York Native was really the first reportage in the gay community on this new health crisis. And the group that became Gay Men's Health Crisis was founded in a party at Larry Kramer's apartment in August of 1981. Larry Kramer just passed away last week. But gay men health crisis, the initial fundraising efforts were really dismal. Kramer's scathing editorials about AIDS in the New York Native ultimately led to his split from gay men's health crisis. And because the groups that were affected were referred to frequently as the 3 H's in the early days, homosexuals, Haitians, and hemophiliacs, plus injection drug users, these were all communities that were stigmatized or didn't really have a lot of political power. And I think that the marginalization that the disease initially received can be seen in its name it was given, and that its initial name was GRID, standing for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. And it took over a year for the CDC to change that to AIDS as we know it today. In comparison to what Chris talked about with the 1918 influenza, progression of HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, could be a very slow motion experience. Once someone had been affected, there might be a years-long incubation period before they experienced any specific physical signs of the illness, which meant also that AIDS could spread very silently over time. That spread was really influenced and made worse by political indifference, by active hostility on the part of the Reagan administration. In October of 1982, over a year into the epidemic, Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, was asked by a reporter about the administration's reaction to AIDS. And in response, Speakes called it the gay plague and asked the reporter several times if he had AIDS. And all of that was to the laughter of the press corps that was gathered there. There's video of this incident. And an AIDS prevention plan was not developed until 1985. Even then, the Reagan administration and Congress rejected it. President Reagan did not mention AIDS publicly until September of '85, and there was no funding approved to fight the disease until October of that year. In addition to the response from the politicians, the mainstream media also showed a lot of hesitancy to discuss the epidemic in any specific or extensive way. Only one reporter actually showed up to even cover the first hearing that Congress held about AIDS in 1982. And there was initially also this nothing to worry about yet attitude, which sort of treated the entire audience of the media as heterosexual and assumed that the disease wouldn't spread widely to a heterosexual population. As an example, there was an editorial that the New York Times published in 1986, in November of 1986, 5 years into the epidemic, that was titled, "Don't Panic Yet Over AIDS." And the editorial's takeaway argument is AIDS is still confined to homosexuals and intravenous drug addicts, and the United States doesn't need to worry about rates of heterosexual transmission that were then being seen in its initial stages in Africa. I'll quote the final sentence, which is the editorial writer, "To prevent further spread of AIDS, the smartest thing to do now is to resist exaggerated fears of heterosexual transmission and to fund more drug treatment programs." So the gay community, which was hardest hit, was seen by the writer as a thing apart on its own, really responsible for its own reaction to the disease and not to be worried about by a presumed heterosexual reader of the paper, and that being over 5 years into the AIDS crisis. So the literary reaction, I'm going to split that into talking quickly about drama and then fiction and then poetry. Initial dramatic representation of AIDS tended to focus on kind of the physical ravages of the disease and the social and psychological effects. The first AIDS play, Robert Chesley's Night Sweat, is an example of that, and William Hoffman's play from 1985, As Is. Then you have a political statement with Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart, which was based on his experience in the early years of AIDS with founding the Gay Men's Health Crisis, his split from Gay Men's Health Crisis, and the activism that he started to promote surrounding AIDS. But the real dramatic response that got the most attention, definitely Tony Kushner's Angels in America. It won the Tony Award for Best Play in both 1993 and 1994, since it was a two-part play. And it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in addition in 2003. So maybe the most, definitely the most sophisticated, wide-ranging kind of treatment of AIDS in drama. With fiction, there was really a range of responses. Similar to drama, the first-hand accounts tended to be from people with AIDS talking about the physical and the mental and the social effects. Paul Reed's novel Facing It was published by Gay Sunshine Press in 1984. That's usually considered the first AIDS novel. But also it's really elegant, short stories written by Alan Barnett in The Body and Its Dangers, or the French novelist Hervé Guibert with his novel To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life. But with this range of responses, it also went on another direction towards sort of angry comedy. David Feinberg's black comedy novel 86th. There were very a thread of elegiac responses in novels about AIDS. I'm thinking particularly Christopher Coe's novel, Such Times, which is about a man thinking back in a first-person narration, telling about his older lover who has died from AIDS. And a little later in 1998, Mark Marlis's novel, An Arrow's Flight, which uses a modernized retelling of the Trojan War to look at the influence and effect of AIDS on gay community. There were also socio-political statements. I'm thinking Sarah Schulman's novel, People in Trouble, and also novels that were about the effects of those who'd been left behind or about those who were caring for people with AIDS. Rebecca Brown has a sort of novel and stories, The Gifts of the Body, on those lines. And also Chris Bram, who's right here with us today, his novel In Memory of Angel Clare, about the effect of one man's death on the community of friends that he leaves behind. As for poetry, there wasn't one formal response in general to AIDS. There tended to be more of a split, though, stylistically. There were poets who addressed AIDS with direct and raw emotion, and then there was more formal, more traditionally elegiac kinds of work. I thought that I would read a poem that's in the anthology I edited, Persistent Voices. It's by a young British poet named Adam Johnson. He died at age 28, but he tended towards a bit more of the formalist aspects of AIDS poetry. I'm going to read a poem of his that's actually in rhyme and meter, called the Departure Lounge. He's gone to the departure lounge, you said. Meaning, of course, he had not long to live. Your tone was serious. I smiled instead, struck by the metaphor you chose to give, the irreversible process of decline, and one you must have loved in your own way, and how a quirk of speech can redefine the real sense of loss. Now, every day, the faces have grown thinner around the bar. We lose each other and we have not met, our separation ever more bizarre, based as it is on mutual regret, ironic in its total unity. Death and the fear of death, of sensual fraud, darken the private chambers of the city, that echoes like a vast communal ward with a dry-throated rage. Clenching our pills, we leave our doctors, newly diagnosed, think only of the virus that it kills, and how much to confide. Or are composed, armed with a clearer knowledge as we chance a cool, controlled reaction. I recall profound relief, a kind of arrogance. I had not reckoned that the sky would fall. There was an attempt with, I think, Michael Klein's anthology, Poets for Life, which had both poets with AIDS, gay and straight poets, writing about the disease, an attempt to really kind of try to take the measure of the disease when that was published in the late 1980s. But again, I see really this split between the more formal and the more raw when it comes to sort of the AIDS, the reaction to AIDS in poetry. And I think then there was kind of a period of forgetting. There was the introduction of the drug cocktail of protease inhibitors that helped diminish the effects of the disease, helped keep people alive. That was sort of in December of 95, heading into 1996. So AIDS did not end. Those who couldn't afford or access the drugs, those whose cases were too far gone or whose bodies did not react to protease inhibitors, but the death toll seriously decreased. It went from a peak of about 42,000 deaths in 1995 to between 16 and 17,000 by 1997. By 2018, over 700,000 people in the United States had died from AIDS, and around 6,000 people, according to the CDC, still die every year in the US from AIDS. I think following that introduction of protease inhibitors, there was a severe decrease in the output of people writing about AIDS. I think fatigue from years of battling the disease within the gay community, survivor's guilt that I mentioned before, and also just untold thousands of people believed that they were going to die from the disease. And once protease inhibitors were introduced, they really had to take stock of their lives and begin to reconstruct their lives. So I think all of those were factors in this period between the mid-90s and I think the early 2010s, when people were not creating a lot of art that addressed HIV and AIDS.
Thank you, Philip, for that overview. And for our viewers, I won't get into this now except to tell our viewers that there are on our reading list other writers and authors, including people from Latin America, things which require you to be able to read in Spanish in some cases, some have been translated, as well as within the Hispanic community in the United States. So I just want to make sure that our viewers know that there's a broad spectrum of people writing about AIDS and that pandemic from multiple perspectives as well. I'm really sort of fascinated by the how shall I say this? People make constant reference now back to the flu pandemic of 1918 from a sort of social scientific perspective of how it affects people's lived lives, how government responds, how we're under quarantine, how if we break quarantine, we'll have a second peak, just like 1918. So it feels like there's a cultural touchstone or memory to the flu pandemic of 1918, even if we don't want to write about it. And no one seems to me to make references to the AIDS pandemic in the same way. And I have a couple of thoughts about this that I'd like you guys to maybe explore. And one of them is the contrast between the 1918 flu pandemic and the AIDS crisis and the targeting of young people, because it sort of seems to me that the memories that we do have exploring the 1918 flu pandemic is about youth. I don't know if that's accurate enough. But
that's true. Yeah.
And we also have that parallel with World War I, right, and the sort of lost youth, which we also have with the AIDS pandemic. But as Philip so eloquently put it, right, it's a marginal community that nobody really wants to pay attention to and values, and we can laugh about it in press conferences and so forth. But I wonder if
it still is, not just during the time of the pandemic, but if we think about how the heterosexual transmission that was kind of poo-pooed in '86 by the New York Times, the majority of heterosexual transmission today occurs in the United States and around the world in minority communities. I think that there's still a marginalization of discussion of the disease because it may have transferred in focus in certain ways from one minority to another.
right, and also those are also the same communities that can't necessarily access the preventive, prophylactic, or treatment methods to keep themselves healthy or prevent infection in the first place. Not to mention sort of cultural complications and all of that as well. But so yeah, I don't know where I want to go with this question about youth, but I just sort of wonder how the role of youth plays in these things, and because I also feel with the COVID experience, the primary target seems to have been elderly people, or at least that's how it's sort of discussed. And yet when we want to shock the population into paying attention to COVID, we look at this 36-year-old that died, or this 20-year-old that died. And so I don't know, I'm trying to think through this question of youth and how disease or pandemic impacts youth and how that plays into memory.
Well, it's easier to romanticize a death from youth, although that can take you only so far. I mean, people did not want to talk about the deaths from the 1918 flu epidemic. They did not want to talk about the deaths from AIDS. Interesting that with COVID affecting an older population, we're now finding out they've been undercounting the deaths in nursing homes. They just have not been keeping track of that because it's not, somebody somewhere doesn't think that's important, that the elderly are not worth following as closely. So it's, maybe we just don't like to think about death at all. And sometimes you can slip in as a sort of romantic lie that, oh, the young, it's so much more tragic, let's give attention to them. But that carries people only so far too.
I think of something like even A.E. Housman's poem, To an Athlete Dying Young. I think what Chris is talking about, this romanticization of the death of youth, is definitely very present. But to pick up on something else that he said, we have no idea how many people have died from COVID-19, from coronavirus in the United States, because it's completely undercounted. And I think back to something like the AIDS pandemic, where many families try to hide the actual cause of death. So I think there's definitely an urge to look away from the tragedy of these sorts of diseases, no matter what population they're hitting.
Mm-hmm. So how would we then understand why something like AIDS, even with that sort of decade gap of memory and creative production about it, had more things written about it than the 1918 pandemic? Is it due just to that the 1918 pandemic was relatively rapid, and AIDS is still ongoing, or?
That's a good question. I have my theory. It's a combination of different elements. One is that it was so drawn out. It was happening in slow motion, as Philip said. And but I think it hit the gay population at a time when gay men had discovered literature, that they had just, after Stonewall, you had this kind of explosion of gay and lesbian writing. And so there were people who could write about this. Movies were not touching it, TV wasn't touching it, but writers would touch it. And they suddenly gave them something they needed to write about. And I think that really was fed a lot into this huge production of plays, novels, poetry. I mean, and you can, comparing what was written about AIDS to what was written about the pandemic of 1918. I mean, there's no comparison at all. It's like just a minute number of books and about the flu epidemic with this huge amount of written material about AIDS. Bill, do you have any theories building on that or adding to that, or?
I'm really curious myself as to why people didn't write about the 1918 pandemic. I don't know if it's that there's something also inherently more dramatic about the way that AIDS was transmitted.
Yeah.
That it's transmitted sexually.
Sex, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that that's something, too, where there's a lot longer process with AIDS that people can write about. From first realizing that you have it, especially once tests existed for antibodies, the period between knowing that you were HIV positive and the time that you might die from AIDS could be years, whereas it was much, much faster with the 1918 pandemic. So there's more periods along the way to be discussed. Everything from that period of not knowing that you have it to what do you do and what occurs to people once they've actually discovered their diagnosis. How does that play out? The fact of the death. There's a whole variety of different stages of grief and stages of acceptance of the disease that could be discussed, I think, with AIDS rather than with something like the flu or perhaps with coronavirus.
Yeah, it had all these psychological, interpersonal qualities that gave you something really real to write about. It was much more complicated than just you get sick, you suffer, and you die. It was had all these other ramifications. Plus, what you talked about earlier, this was a marginalized population, so that was kind of gave another edge to the writing, another thing to write about.
It was also, I would think, and you may know better than I do, Chris, since you lived through this, whereas I was born in 1980, so really I was not living through this period and engaging with the literature. But it would be very difficult as a gay male writer during the 1980s and first half of the 90s at the least, to write about any current gay life and not address AIDS. Writers perhaps didn't feel that sense of urgency to discuss the pandemic when it again occurred quickly, and when there's so many other things kind of going on in the general population, the war, for example. Whereas with AIDS, if you were a gay writer and you were writing in current times and not mentioning AIDS, that would be inexplicable to your audience.
Yeah.
So, sort of following up on what both of you have said, do you think another impetus for writers to write about AIDS was also clamoring to be heard? I mean, that the crisis, that the AIDS crisis prompted a more urgency, I guess, to gay voices and to be heard. That there's something sort of inherently political about writing about it in ways that the flu pandemic didn't require.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there was. Although interestingly, it was the writers felt it, the publishing industry may have felt it. I don't think readers felt it. Readers did not really want to read about this. It was, I'm living with it every day, this fear, why do I need to read about it? The idea of that will help you think about it. People would resist. They did not want to think about it. But the writers felt the need to write about it. it's interesting how much of the best work early on was in theater, which is a much more social, political area, I think, than novels. But it was theater and it was poetry. That was the most intimate and the most public were the areas where the writing about AIDS, I think, was the strongest. I mean, there were good AIDS novels, but they did not receive the kind of attention that the plays did. And the poems it took, I mean, well, we've talked about this before. Poetry is a smaller audience.
Both William Hoffman's As Is and Kushner's Angels in America get turned into movies.
Yeah.
And I may just be forgetting something obvious, but I can't think of a sort of novel of AIDS that got turned into a widely seen film. And of course, Kramer's The Normal Heart had a long period where people were trying to make it into a film. So I think that there was that that popularity and urge to do something with theater, with live theater, that did not exist as much for fiction.
Yeah, I cannot think of a novel about AIDS that was turned into a movie.
None of the novels that I mentioned in my talk here that I think are on our recommended reading list were turned into films either.
Yeah.
And if you think more modern times, there was a film version of Rent, correct?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. So even a more recent play that has AIDS as a theme gets turned into a movie, but I haven't seen that, I don't think, with.
But Normal Heart finally got made into a movie. It took. It was no longer necessary the way it had been earlier, but it finally got made. It finally got made when it was safer, when people were less scared of the subject, I think. I've told you, for the first time, I've had people interested in doing a film of my novel In Memory of Angel Clare. And at first I thought, are you guys serious? Nobody wanted to touch this when it came out. It's a sad, painful story. But then talking to them, I realized, well, now it's history, and it's approachable. It's not as scary as it once was. I'm recently the new play, The Inheritance, the 6-hour extravaganza about the younger gay generation meeting the older generation, and what they do not have in common, what has to be explained to them, is AIDS. And it's very effective. Without giving it, the end of part 1 is very, very powerful. It's and it's all about how many people died during the AIDS epidemic. And as a kind of, it's a coup of theater. It has this poetic power. It's very strong. It's the best thing in the play. But that was written by somebody who I think was born only in, I think he might even be younger than you, Philip. I mean, he's, to him, it's all history.
Do you think, Chris, that would be made into a more accessible format like film or something?
I think it probably will. And it was a huge hit in Britain. I think probably, with TV, you can do, Normal Heart was a TV film, a very big, high budget. Angels in America got made into a kind of first-rate HBO cable TV film. So maybe that'll happen with The Inheritance. It would lend itself to it.
I have 2 questions, but I want to give Philip a chance to chime in too.
No, please go ahead, Richard.
Well, so I wonder, Chris, if you could talk a little bit more about Angel Clare, and then I'll ask my other question. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about Angel Clare.
Okay, well, I could say simply that it was my 3rd novel. My first novel was published in '86. So during the height of the AIDS epidemic, but it's set in the 70s. So in a way, already it was a historical novel. People would talk about it that way. I originally thought of Angel Claire as basically about circle of friends, male and female, and their friend Clarence, known as Angel Claire, has died a year earlier. And the friends are basically stuck with custody of his last boyfriend, who is this very innocent, callow kid named Michael. And it's kind of a comedy of bad manners, you might call it, or maybe a tragedy of bad manners.
Chris, you broke up, honey.
But I had no stories to tell about AIDS. And when this story kind of came to me in little pieces, I thought, oh, okay, good. Now I finally have a subject. You cannot write about disease and death head on. You need to have a story like oven mitts almost.
About Angel Claire, it broke up around the point where I think you were talking about how you figured out how to get into the writing of it.
Okay, yeah, but basically, as I was saying, I wanted to write about AIDS, but I didn't know how. I didn't have a story to tell, and because you cannot write about pain and suffering head on, you need a story. And oh, thank you, yeah. And so when this story came to me, I thought, okay, now I have it. I have the story. And interestingly, my agent at the time, Eric Ashworth, he said, do you have any ideas what you want to write next? I said, well, maybe a collection of short stories, but there's a short novel I want to write. And I described him the situation of Angel Claire, and he said, that's not a short novel, that's a novel. That's your next book. I want to read that book. Interestingly, Eric himself later died of AIDS. I mean, it was important to him. And so with his encouragement, I wrote In Memory of Angel Claire.
So, Chris, unfortunately, unlike Philip, all of my books are in my office, which I can't access due to quarantine, because all the books behind me are about the ancient world.
These are Davide's books.
These are Davide's books, yes. So would you describe Angel Claire as a collection of vignettes, sort of, as in a collection of memoirs? Would that? No.
No, it's a novel it's about it's an ensemble novel. It's about a circle of friends and how each of them are reacting to Michael, to this kid. Right. Michael's like 21 or 22. The friends are all in their mid to late 30s. Actually, I think they're all in their late 30s. And there's the difference of age, and then there's the suspicion that Michael doesn't really understand what's happened. He is not missing Clarence the way we do. Right. I mean, in time that turns out he just hasn't dealt with it well yet. And during the course of the novel, he does.
I mean, it's been a while since I've read that. I was just trying to think how that paralleled. I mean, not paralleled, but how there was some echoes to something written by the Chilean author Lemebel, which has this sort of collection of more like vignettes about a circle of friends, but all of them and their impact by AIDS. And I don't know, something for me to explore at some point, but it just sort of made me think of that.
Well, each of these people, go ahead.
Like Angel Claire is the process of this group of friends coming to terms with their friend's death through the process of reaching détente with the boyfriend.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. So in each of these people, they have their individual lives, and they're affected in different ways. But it does kind of connect up like a novel. It is a novel. It's not just a series of vignettes. Although they do have very separate individual lives.
Right. Well, I do hope that movie or miniseries or something is made out of this. It would be nice to have some more of your stuff appear in other media formats.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, it would be nice. I'd love to see actors playing these roles. I mean, it's some good characters there. So.
I also wanted to just do a plug for another module I forgot to mention at the beginning. We're going to have a segment also on AIDS representation in art, and I think it's going to focus primarily on folk art and like the quilt and things like that. And it's curious to me, the quilt used to, I mean, pieces of the quilt used to be something, right, that toured and so forth. And it doesn't seem to resonate with at least the college age audience anymore. And I just sort of wonder how that's going to impact how we also talk about literature in its respect of AIDS, and how people are going to read it. Like, are people going to read it? And is it too much history? I don't know if that makes sense, but I find it challenging, I think, to teach some of this. Like I taught Angels in America this last semester, and I'm curious as to how that was the narrative that became kind of mainstream, that everybody knows it, because I found it not resonating with my audience, which are, 18 to 21-year-olds.
It's a tough play, and I think it requires some historical knowledge they may not automatically have. Who's Roy Cohn? A lot of them might be thinking, why was this guy significant? I guess there was a recent documentary, Where's My Roy Cohn, that would fill that in. But I think that's it's a difficult play to follow, I think, for someone who doesn't have any of the historical background the three of us have.
Yeah, that's
even at my age, even having been born again right around the time when AIDS began in the U.S. or came to attention in the U.S., I still was living in the society where there was a lot of justifiable paranoia about this particular disease. It was a major topic of conversation in school, a topic of nasty joking among school children. I didn't know what they were talking about. And then of course I became interested in that time period and was reading all this work. But I think for people who are younger than I am, people who are in their teens and 20s now, it's going to be very hard to understand the context because they don't see people die. They don't hear about people dying of AIDS. It's not in the water like it is for people who are my age and older.
Yeah.
I guess two caveats to that. One is I had to teach it when we moved online, so there was no longer the classroom context for teaching it. And so I can't guarantee that they read the historical sort of blurb I gave them to sort of fill in gaps that might be useful for them. I think also they were maybe a little put off, again, perhaps because we were doing it remotely, by the more magic realist elements of it, the dream sequences and hallucinations and things like that. So that may have been part of what created a barrier for them to appreciate it. I will also say that I tried to make it relevant to the moment by tying Roy Cohn to Donald Trump, because there are real historical connections there. But that didn't.
The title of that movie about Cohn, Where's My Roy Cohn, is a Donald Trump quote, asking, where is the person who's going to, get rid of my problems? Like Cohn got rid of so many prominent people's problems as this nasty, hard-charging lawyer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah, so, I tried that tack too, but I also, there's a certain, this generation of college students is particularly overwhelmed, I think, with their own traumas of, school shootings constantly and evolving family structures that maybe aren't nurturing them the way they need to be nurtured or the way we know how to nurture them. And then with the pandemic and the closing of school, I think that maybe they couldn't get their minds into it the way I had hoped. But
the quilt, since you also asked about the quilt, I think you really have to see that in person, some portion of it laid out for it to have emotional resonance or emotional impact. I've read that recently it's been acquired by or is entering into a partnership with the National AIDS Memorial Grove, the National AIDS Memorial in San Francisco. And I think having walked through that grove and having seen parts of the quilt in person, that if your students were able to have a more visceral experience with it by being in person, that it might make more of an effect than just hearing about it or seeing the panels online.
Yeah, or even like at Canisius, they used to bring a small panel segment. I mean, I don't even know the dimensions. Maybe it was 6x4 dimensions, something like that. But it didn't really draw people, and it didn't really resonate. And I don't.
They don't have friends who have died of it.
Well, and see that's
Yeah.
And that brings me to sort of back to our current pandemic, that I sort of feel that people take it seriously if you've seen it. If you've seen the sirens, if you've seen the morgue freezer trucks, if you see it somehow, then it's real. But for so many people, it's not real, and that sort of, I think, is how people react to AIDS narrative things. Or so I think we're fighting two different things. We're fighting either a willful forgetfulness because it was so traumatic, or well, it hasn't happened to me, it's not real thing. Like I think sort of, and as Chris said at the beginning, right, that we don't like to necessarily talk about death or explore death. And yeah, so I think that there's a constant struggle with remembering and how we remember and why we remember.
Maybe some of the movies that have come out recently might help your students have a greater reaction to what they're learning about. I'm thinking of both the documentaries, things like United in Anger and How to Survive a Plague and We Were Here about San Francisco. But also, I'm blanking on the name of the French film that came out that covered the French Act Up. It was a feature film, not a doc.
Beat of My Heart.
BPM, beats per minute.
Beats per minute. Yeah.
I wonder if some of the films, because they are bringing in that great archival footage and maybe might be a bit more visceral for, I keep returning to that word, visceral for your students, again, rather than just kind of reading about it or hearing about it.
That's true. I might explore that too, and I will actually add these to our list so our viewers can also explore some of those things as well. We've talked quite a bit, and it's always a pleasure to talk to both of you.
I have a question though for Chris and you, Richard. Do you think that there will be another any kind of artistic reaction to the coronavirus? Do you think that artistic reaction will ultimately be more like that to the 1918 flu, or more like that to HIV/AIDS pandemic?
A good question. I've been wondering that myself. I'm probably more like the 1918 flu. I mean, here's something where everybody's experiencing it. So it's not like it'll be news to anyone, but they're kind of stories, sort of personal stories that happen to take place with that. And it's more than a background, but it's kind of this, it's just part of, it's not the whole story. There's, I think more like that, because it's not, there won't be that urgency we had with the age writing we were talking about, where you want to get the news out. You want to share the news. because it won't be news to share because everybody will have already experienced it. I think that was maybe one of the things that caused this sort of forgetting of the 1918 flu epidemic. It was like, oh, we've already been there. We all experienced it. We don't need to talk about it. And it was individuals who needed to talk about some pain they suffered during that period who actually then wrote about it. And maybe that will happen with the pandemic.
I guess it remains to be seen.
I noticed that there's been a small push online. I've heard several times people suggesting, and there may be some projects that are already doing this, that people should be keeping diaries right now, should be documenting and be thinking in a very conscious, historic way about documenting their lives during this pandemic, so that there is not that sort of level of forgetfulness. But I don't know whether there's going to be an artistic reaction to coronavirus so much as that more historically focused one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip, for asking that question, because that was something I was going to ask and obviously forgot to, to ask that. I have noticed something interesting. It's not literary, but it is, I think, an artistic response, is there's different indigenous groups in Mexico that have turned their handiwork towards making masks with regional indigenous patterns and so forth, that I find really interesting. And actually, you're getting one of those as a thank you gift for participating. But
Very functional.
some of them are not commercially produced, because it's all hand done, but with an eye towards commercial distribution. But I also know that a mouche who's making them, and mouches are the third gender pre-Columbian indigenous identity that sort of occupies both male and female functions within their society, and they tend to make their living through embroidery and things like that. Many of my shirts actually come from that. And I suggested this to her. What if you made some? I will buy them. And she resisted at first. Not out of, I mean, she, you know, that would be a source of livelihood for her. That's important. But by the same token, she didn't want to feel that she was compromising her indigenous, authentic craft for a momentary response.
For
right?
current events or
Yeah. But she has come around and decided to make them. And I guess I'll have to ask her more about her thought process on that. So I do see something interesting happening in other parts of the world about artistic response, but it's not, how should I say this? It's not directly addressing the virus. It's repurposing an artistic or craft skill in response to the virus, but not necessarily sort of commenting on the virus experience. I guess maybe that's the way to put it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what develops from this. The other thing that I've noticed, and I have not noticed this as much in English, but I've noticed a lot of creativity. Again, it's not it doesn't rise to the level of theater, poetry, literature, art, but a lot of humor through, I guess maybe like performance humor. And I saw a lot of this coming out of Spain, actually, of people responding not necessarily to the virus, but to quarantine or to the resulting difficulties of the virus. So making fun of how society is responding to it. I don't know if that's going to evolve into something more, but it is a socially creative response. It's not literature or theater, but you know, when you've got short videos that are processing it through humor, I don't know, there's something maybe worth exploring there as well.
Well, some of the things Saturday Night Live was doing with their Zoom session, and most of it didn't work, but a couple of them did. And it's kind of like, oh, that's interesting, because it was using humor to kind of what can you, this is a new experience for us, how do we deal with it? And a lot of it didn't work, but some of it did. So that was, I wonder if any of that will kind of linger on afterwards once we can see each other face to face again, once we can go to movie theaters and stage theaters again.
Right. Well, I want to thank both of you for a very interesting conversation. I always learn so much and take lots of notes to keep thinking about these things.
Well, thank you for inviting us. I had a great time. It was great thinking about this, and always great talking to Philip too. And just these were good questions. It's a really strong subject, so thank you.
It's always lovely seeing you both, even if we are separated off on the interwebs. So thank you very much too for inviting us, Richard. It's been really thought-provoking.
Well, for me as well. And as always, I enjoy and value our friendship, and I hope that you continue to be safe and sane, which for me, the latter part is a bit of a challenge occasionally.
For us all.
For us all, yes.
And that's why we need literature. So
yes, to keep us sane, yes. So.
That's right. No, for real. Like, that's actually true.
Yeah.
So on that note, thank you both, and my regards to the different two-legged and four-legged people that you share living spaces with. And we'll talk soon. Okay.
Okay. So great seeing you guys. To be continued.
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye.